Deep Sea Embers Chapter 361 to 365. Nemo felt an abrupt and intense pulsation within his chest. The sensation was uncanny and entirely new to him. He perceived the ominous figure of the ghost captain looming before him, not merely issuing a benign promise but asserting a certainty that had already solidified in some uncharted future. Where this intuition originated from, Nemo could not fathom. Yet, he found himself instinctively bowing his head in involuntary respect, uttering his response with an inexplicable sense of reverence, as you say. Duncan, in receipt of Nemo's acquiescence, returned his nod. His attention then casually drifted towards the old man standing at a distance, resting his weary body against the wall and seemingly engrossed in deep contemplation. In this moment, the old man's ramblings about the Frost Queen were absent, as were his seemingly nonsensical mutterings about the second waterway and the rebels. He merely stood there, his mind apparently adrift in a temporal and spatial realm that was teetering on the brink of oblivion. In the maelstrom of the old man's chaotic recollections, did the Frost Queen still hold sway over this realm? Pulling his gaze away, Duncan beckoned Alice, who was similarly deep in her thoughts. Together with Vanna and Morris, they made their way towards the concealed exit. Soon enough, they emerged above ground, vacated the confines of the Golden Flute tavern, and stepped onto the bustling streets of Frost. As the setting sun inched towards the skyline, its majestic silhouette along with the enigmatic dual-runed circle just touched the tip of several spires of the high city. Visually, it gave an impression as though the towering edifices built by mortal hands were supporting the chains binding the sun, suspending it in the city's sky. The onset of dusk signaled the imminent curfew. In response to the stricter curfew rules, the crowd rushed to their homes or the closest night shelters. Amidst this flurry, Duncan and his group, who were sauntering nonchalantly, stood in stark contrast. Nevertheless, they barely garnered attention from the busy crowd. With a sense of intrigue, Vanna whispered to Duncan as she drew closer to him, "What are your thoughts on this matter?" Responding with a calm demeanor, Duncan queried, "Are you referring to the origin of the counterfeits? It's as if they materialized out of thin air. Neither Morris nor I could find any indications using our investigative techniques, and even you couldn't uncover any clues," Vanna concurred with a gentle nod. "We had always operated under the assumption that even these peculiar counterfeits would abide by normal operational procedures, with a definite source and a discernible course of transmission." Duncan eased his pace and tilted his head slightly, probing, "So, are you suggesting that these counterfeits could possibly possess some form of spatial capability, bypassing the bounds of reality to materialize directly at specified locations?" "That is my hypothesis." Neither confirming nor denying her conjecture, Duncan paused for a few seconds before he abruptly inquired, "Did I ever share with you the story of Alice's maiden voyage on the ship?" Caught off guard, Vanna blinked. "No, you didn't. What transpired when Alice first boarded the ship?" The puppet, ensnared within her coffin, had a penchant for returning to the vanished. "I tossed her, along with her wooden box, into the sea thrice, and on each occasion, she and her coffin made their way back to the ship," Duncan conveyed in an unperturbed tone. "What is your theory behind her mysterious reappearance?" Lost in contemplation for a moment, Vanna eventually voiced her unsure conjecture. Could it be the product of a curse? Some form of recurring ability that stems from anomaly 099. Does it also involve spatial powers? No, her means of return were surprisingly simpler. She paddled her way back, using the coffin lid as a makeshift oar. Her speed was remarkable, Duncan explained with steady calmness. Once she reached the ship, she exerted considerable strength to climb directly up the hull from the stern. Due to her swift approach, I failed to apprehend her the first 2 times, only managing to do so on the 3rd attempt. Vanna remained silent, processing this surprising revelation. Simultaneously, the youthful inquisitor and Morris swiveled their heads to regard Miss Alice, the seemingly innocuous puppet, who was glancing around. Noticing their gaze, she responded with an innocent smile. "I wouldn't dismiss outright that those counterfeits could potentially materialize directly within the city-state through some form of spatial teleportation. However, logically speaking, if they indeed possessed such teleportation capabilities, why would the seagull need to traverse the vast expanse of the open sea rather than just materializing directly in the harbor?" Duncan offered indifferently. I am more inclined to believe that the counterfeits still necessitate conventional means of transportation, and the reason why the counterfeit in the sewer seemed to appear out of thin air is likely due to our oversight, much like how ordinary folks wouldn't anticipate that the true cause of a cursed puppet's persistent returns is her exceptional swimming speed and formidable strength. He paused, his thoughts trailing off before he continued. It's even plausible that the place where Crow accidentally trespassed was also a result of this type of oversight. Breaking his silence, Morris had an epiphany. Could there be an unobservable passageway or a rift that opens periodically? It's difficult to ascertain, but this issue is undoubtedly connected to those cultists, Duncan concluded. What Crow recovered on that fragment of paper caught my eye. It doesn't resemble mere gibberish, heretical thoughts. Instead, it seems as if they're employing a modern, yet indecipherable language to recount historical events. And such records have always held a certain allure for those cultists. Perhaps it's time we involve Dog, and surely, the demon's eyes may reveal secrets in dimensions beyond reality. A gust of gray wind infiltrated the entrance of the Harbor Defense Office, carrying within it gatekeeper Agatha. Seated behind his desk, Colonel Lister glanced up at the gatekeeper, who had materialized in his office without prior notice. You've foregone even announcing your arrival this time. Apologies for the abruptness, but we are dealing with an emergency, Agatha uttered, her eyes then drifting to the shadowy circles under Lister's eyes. You forewent sleep last night. It appears I'm not the only one who spent the night awake, Lister replied, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We devoted the entire night to decoding the mysterious signal transmitted by the Mist Fleet. The scene was rather heated. Our cryptographers and mathematicians nearly resorted to physical altercations with chairs and fists. I never imagined these composed scholars could descend to the level of slinging familial insults during a disagreement. A silence enveloped Agatha for a moment, her eyes holding an unusual expression. After a pause, she shared, the cathedral may soon borrow a handful of your scholars, specifically those specializing in cryptography and mathematics. Lister exhibited surprise. Why is that? Agatha's face remained impassive, with bandages obscuring half of it, to unravel the unsavory secret bequeathed by another equally unsavory entity. Seems like your predicaments match mine. Lister sighed before regaining his composure. Now, let's address the crux of the matter. What information do you seek with this unanticipated visit? It's regarding the city-state's blockade, Agatha declared. Under normal circumstances, the silent cathedral wouldn't intervene in the city-state's defensive matters. However, the current situation is exceptional, and I can't ignore my worries. I understand, Lister nodded in affirmation. Rest assured, the entirety of Frost is currently under an airtight seal. Should there exist any unsealed regions, considering the colossal mist fleet amassed in the adjacent sea, no one would dare to enter or exit. We've momentarily suspended all permits for harbor departure and alerted the nearby city-states as well as seafaring vessels to maintain a safe distance from Frost. All requests to dock at the harbor received to date have been denied. That's comforting, at least the issue won't exacerbate. Agatha sighed with visible relief. And what about Dagger Island? It remains under lockdown until the cathedral provides further expert guidance, Lister mentioned with a slightly grave tone. As of yesterday, the island has been dispatching, all is normal, routine reports. Despite the cessation of material supplies to the island from the city-state and the cutting off of all communication responses, they've exhibited no additional reaction. Do not lower your vigilance. The seagull incident is evidence that the island's contamination has an inclination to actively spread to the city-state. That entity won't merely comply, Agatha warned gravely. The cathedral is amassing a force composed of death priests and combat ascetics, but the unsealing of potent holy relics demands additional time. Lister gave a nod of understanding, and it seemed as though he was about to voice another thought when the abrupt sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor halted him. A harbor soldier appeared in the doorway of the office. Lister cast his gaze towards the soldier, who expressed distinct urgency. What's the matter? The soldier stood rigidly, promptly conveying his report. Sir, a ship slated to dock at Frost hasn't arrived as scheduled. A delay in arrival. That's unexpected. Lister furrowed his brows. Considering all the routes surrounding the city-state are currently sealed, it's natural that no ships would be docking. Sir, it's not a matter of docking, the ship hasn't appeared at all. The soldier hastily clarified, that particular ship was due to arrive today, and we had arranged to dispatch a notification regarding the city-state's blockade to it. However, it failed to establish any contact. We reached out to Cold Harbor just a while ago, and they verified that the ship had fulfilled its supply replenishment and inspection there without any issues. But mysteriously, it vanished without leaving any trace upon nearing the waters surrounding Frost. At this news, Lister's countenance turned gravely serious. He drew a deep, measured breath, rising from his desk, and pressed, "What's the name of the missing ship?" "It's called the White Oak. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories." Agatha stepped purposefully forward, her voice tinged with a certain gravitas as she asked, "Can you explain the origin of this so-called missing ship?" The vessel, it set sail from planned, made a pit stop at Lanza for provisions and continued towards Cold Harbor. The soldier, who was called in to update on the unfolding situation, replied promptly. Its final destination was Frost. Everything seemed to be normal until it docked at Cold Harbor for supplies. Colonel Lister, evidently frustrated, ran a hand across his forehead. "This is a disaster. We're already swamped with our own multitude of issues. Now, a ship has mysteriously vanished just before it was due to dock at Frost. We're spread too thin to devote resources to incidents occurring outside our city-state at the moment." Agatha, her gaze fixed on the city's defense commander, retorted with a sober tone, "But, Colonel, as you just mentioned, the ship disappeared just shy of reaching Frost. It's entirely plausible that it fell victim to some unexplained phenomena." Upon hearing this, Lister raised his eyes to meet hers. "You're suggesting our city-state, Frost, is currently under the siege of an inexplicable force causing a surge of unusual incidents. The Seagull incident stands as a testament that these anomalies aren't restricted to our city's land mass, and with the recent disappearance of the White Oak near our territorial waters, it's possible that a much larger anomaly is looming over Frost. It seems to encompass not only our terrestrial domain but also a substantial section of the adjoining sea." Agatha detailed her theory. In response, Lister leaned heavily on the table, his knuckles turning white. After a few beats, he finally looked up. "We need to extend our barricades and send out warnings to all adjacent city-states. The contamination from Frost is spilling over, and a physical blockade may prove insufficient." As he spoke, he abruptly fell silent, gritting his teeth in obvious reluctance. Agatha, naturally, caught onto this. "What's on your mind, Colonel?" Heaving a sigh, Lister confessed with a gloomy countenance, "I dread that we might need to seek assistance from that damned pirate." "You're referring to Tyrion Abnomar." The color slightly drained from Agatha's face. Although she was the appointed gatekeeper of the city-state, she was also a true-born citizen of Frost and had grown up hearing the hair-raising tales of the infamous Mist Fleet. The old saying, "If you don't sleep, Captain Tyrion will spirit you away when the fog rises," was deeply embedded in the memory of every Frost citizen below 50. Agatha was no exception. She gulped before continuing, "Do you believe he'll be amenable to negotiations?" "A negotiation might be too strong a word. But we certainly need to engage him in dialogue." Lister glanced up, his gaze landing squarely on the city's gatekeeper standing before him. "He arrived here amidst quite a sensitive period, yet he has remained eerily quiet. Initially, I suspected his involvement in the counterfeit scandal that's been plaguing our city, but now it appears more likely that he's here to keep a vigil on the area, much like us. We need to dispatch a representative to him to understand his intentions better." Agatha whispered back, almost to herself, "Folklore paints him as a cursed man, cold and unhinged. They say his breath carries the chill of the icy sea wind, and his stare is enough to freeze the ocean's surface. Who amongst us can serve as this envoy? The tales have a way of embellishing the truth. Anyone with a jot of insight would know that the Mist Fleet maintains standard lines of communication with several factions across the Cold Sea. They even have an enterprise known as the Mist Venture Company that has established an office in Cold Harbor. It's just that this particular pirate has an unusual disdain for Frost." Lister sighed lightly. "The matter of the envoy can be taken care of. Our city-state's military is never short of brave souls, and besides, His voice trailed off as his attention was drawn to something outside the window. Miss Agatha, did you hear anything peculiar just now? Peculiar sounds. Agatha echoed, furrowing her brow as she too turned her gaze towards the window. Almost simultaneously, a distant, low-frequency noise reached her ears. The sound resembled a humming, but it wasn't one that she could identify from any natural source. It seemed to be emanating from the direction of Dagger Island. On the outskirts of Frost's coastline, a naval battleship built of steel, boasting a pristine white hull and 3 primary cannons, sailed leisurely under the Queen's flag. A short, stocky captain stood at the prow, observing the distant developments through his telescope. He was dressed in a Queen's Guard uniform, though it appeared to be a design from half a century ago. There was a disturbingly large hole in his abdomen, through which one could see clean to the other side. The shredded remnants of his uniform around the injury floated lazily in the air as if immersed in seawater, with occasional bubbles surfacing from nowhere. He was a member of the legendary Mist Fleet and the commanding officer of the formidable battleship, Sea Raven, Captain Nixon. At the moment, his gaze was fixed on a tiny island marked by a winding coastline in the distance, where small, obscure shadows were skulking on the water's surface in the same direction. Those were the naval vessels of the Frost City State. While they held a vigilant blockade of Dagger Island from one direction, they kept a wary eye on the maneuvers of the Sea Raven and other ships of the Mist Fleet in close proximity. Those ships sure know how to test one's patience, a sailor sidled up to the shore. Burly Captain Nixon, what if we fire off a few warning shots in their direction? Not unless you fancy being consigned to the engine room and subjected to Admiral Tyrion's round-the-clock punishment, Nixon retorted without turning around. We're not here to engage in a feud with Frost's inhabitants. In the words of our leader, we're temporarily allies. I see, the sailor shrugged, conceding, they're manning the other side of Dagger Island, and we've got this side. So, I suppose we're collaborating quite efficiently. But if they lose their grip on sanity and make any aggressive move, it wouldn't be our fault if our cannons were to accidentally discharge, right? If there's an accidental discharge, you'll be the first to experience a human cannonball experiment. Nixon shot a sideways glance at his subordinate, his gaze returning to the distant island, Dagger Island. Tisk, I recall standing sentinel here back in the day. Back then, it was rich with metal ores ready to be extracted and even housed a small town. The sailor sighed wistfully, ah, those were the golden days. As if about to impart his own memories, Nixon's brow furrowed. But, his expression swiftly hardened upon hearing something. A peculiar hum, it reached his ears. What's that sound? The sailor, standing nearby, immediately stiffened, his face reflecting his anxiety. Is it those Frostians causing it? I'm not certain, but the Frost ships haven't exhibited any unusual behavior. Nixon hastily lifted his telescope. They seem just as clueless. Wait, Dagger Island is in upheaval. His hands lowered the telescope abruptly. His eyes widened in astonishment as they were glued to the distant seascape. An ethereal fog was rising from the direction of Dagger Island, and the strange hum seemed to be emanating from there. It rang in his head like an intrusive thought trying to gnaw its way into his consciousness. The island appeared to stir, its edges dispersing misty tendrils that twisted and billowed in the fog, agitating the sea and fog around it. The island itself was slowly sinking while myriad immense shadows materialized in the fog, reminiscent of titans rousing from their slumber. Nixon watched the spectacle for a beat, then hastily retrieved the telescope, itching to get a more detailed look at the unfolding situation on the island. However, just as he was about to bring the device to his eye, an earth-shaking blast emanated from the area engulfed in the rising fog, swiftly succeeded by a series of intense, quick-fire explosions. Plumes of smoke unfurled from the island, merging with the surrounding sea fog, while the stark bursts of light and the ballet of rising flames were distinctly perceptible even without the aid of a telescope. Dagger Island was being decimated. The entirety of its facilities were detonating in quick succession, and every final safety measure pointed to a single explanation: Contingency 22, nitroglycerin. Nixon found himself captivated by the spectacle, only processing the magnitude of the event after a brief lapse. But then, the sight confronting him once again surpassed his wildest imagination. Dagger Island was submerging, like a dreadnought with a fatally compromised hull, rapidly going under amidst a symphony of explosions. The island, it's sinking. The stunned voice of his subordinate echoed beside him. The sailor, having served at sea for over half a century, was witnessing such a phenomenon for the first time. Did the Frostians cause Dagger Island to sink? Can they really sink an entire island? Poppycock. No explosive in existence possesses such potency. How could an island possibly be sunk? Nixon blurted out instinctively, but the sight before his eyes made him bite back his words. Dagger Island was indeed sinking, and the rate of descent was accelerating, reaching an unthinkable pace. One moment, he could still see 2/3 of the island protruding above the water's surface, the next, only a diminutive mound was visible. And then, mere seconds later, the island had completely vanished from the face of the sea. The fog dissipated, and there was no sign of Dagger Island on the icy sea. Not even a whirlpool formed. Captain Nixon forced a gulp down his throat, muttering in disbelief. The submersion of an island should have theoretically resulted in a formidable whirlpool large enough to consume the world's largest seafaring vessels. However, contrary to expectations, no whirlpool manifested. The waters remained tranquil and undisturbed. It was as if the island hadn't sunk but had merged with the sea. The stack of papers in Lister's grip crashed onto the table as he abruptly rose from his chair. It was more like he had sprung up. His eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at the soldier before him. Repeat what you just said. What happened on Dagger Island? Dagger Island, it's gone. The soldier who had brought the message stuttered, attempting to maintain his composure. Even as a seasoned warrior, this was a challenging situation. A short while ago, we witnessed a chain of explosions erupting on Dagger Island, presumably initiated by the remaining inhabitants who seemed to have set off a series of detonations across different facilities. What followed was the patrol fleet in the vicinity observing the rapid submersion of the island until it completely disappeared beneath the ocean's surface. Were the ships unharmed? Lister inquired promptly, a frown creasing his forehead as he sensed an irregularity. No, the soldier shook his head. The sea surface hardly showed any significant change during Dagger Island's sinking process. Frontline reports suggested, it was as if the island quietly dissolved into the water. The expression on Lister's face darkened considerably. He lapsed into silence for a few moments, then shifted his gaze to Agatha, who was standing nearby. Miss Agatha, based on your knowledge, do any known divine arts, miracles or supernatural objects have the potential to trigger such a phenomenon? No. Agatha promptly shook her head in response. This scale of abnormal event surpasses the boundaries of magic and could be categorized as a miracle, or some kind of anomaly. In any case, this puts us in a serious predicament. We haven't started an investigation yet, and the situation on Dagger Island is still shrouded in mystery. City Hall is not going to appreciate this news. Lister's forehead creased further as he drummed his fingers on the table. Suddenly remembering something, he turned his attention back to the soldier. By the way, how did the Mist Fleet respond? They've held their original position, not breaching the Marine warning line, the soldier reported promptly. However, post the disappearance of Dagger Island, 2 of their speedboats made a brief detour towards the area, stayed for roughly 10 minutes, then swiftly retreated. That indicates they were observing the situation. Seems like this event was also beyond their anticipation. Lister voiced his thoughts slowly. Blast it, we may need to have a word with that sea pirate. The cathedral is also preparing to take action, Agatha chimed in. Given the circumstances, the exploration plans for Dagger Island are now pointless, and we'll be shifting our focus to an extensive investigation of the city. The Guardians have managed to unearth some clues pointing towards the Annihilation cult members' whereabouts and several potential rendezvous points. I will personally oversee a team to address this. I trust you'll make headway, Gatekeeper, Lister said, his eyes rising to meet the black-robed priestess standing before him. The situation is escalating rapidly, and we're in dire need of assistance from the mystical realm more than ever before. We shall do everything in our power. Agatha offered a faint nod, then lifted her staff and gently tapped it against the floor twice. As the echo of the staff connecting with the ground reverberated in the room, her form abruptly morphed into a gust of gray wind. This wind swirled directly into a faint rift that materialized seemingly out of nowhere on the floor. Lister watched the spot where Agatha had disappeared. Only when the rift sealed shut did he exhale a deep sigh, sinking heavily back into his chair as he instructed the soldier, "You may close the door now." His immediate task was to draft an urgent letter to City Hall to shed light on the peculiar incident that transpired right on the outskirts of their city-state. City-state harbor staff were diligently directing ships to their designated docking points, and personnel clad in black or blue uniforms stood on the firm concrete pier, each engrossed in their tasks amidst the biting wind. Their interactions with each other were limited, painting a picture of silent industriousness. A little further away, other ships lay moored. It seemed they had been docked for a while, with only a handful of crew members visible on deck. Their loading, unloading, or restocking procedures appeared to be completed, leaving them possibly awaiting clearance to set sail from the port. Beyond the pier, the main road leading to the city was visible. The expansive road stretched towards the imposing buildings in the distance. Gas lamps lining the road hadn't been lit yet, and since it was nearing dusk, there were few pedestrians about. Only the occasional carriage was seen rushing past on the gradually darkening road. Lawrence stood at the edge of the deck, his gaze fixed on the distant city-state structures. This wasn't his first venture to Frost, but a number of years had passed since his last visit. The considerable time lapse, coupled with his fading memory, made it hard for him to remember the city's previous appearance. Now, as he looked at the distant spires and towers silhouetted against the twilight, a sense of unfamiliarity washed over him. Nevertheless, the White Oak had managed to dock safely in the city-state. Despite the notably harsh weather they had encountered during their voyage, they were fortunate enough to avoid any catastrophic storms. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from behind, prompting the elderly captain to swivel his head and spot his first mate drawing closer. "We're nearly done with the inspection," the first mate informed. "The crew is wondering if they can disembark today. They've been confined to the ship for quite a while." Lawrence lifted his gaze to the sky, and although the world's creation hadn't yet made its appearance, the remnants of the twilight had dimmed almost to the brink of obscurity. He furrowed his brow and shook his head. "It's too late now. The city imposes a curfew after sundown, and disembarking now wouldn't leave them anywhere to go. They should remain on board the ship for tonight. I'll personally visit the Harbor Affairs Bureau later to deal with the remaining formalities. By tomorrow morning, everyone else can go ashore." "Understood. I'll relay your instructions," the first mate responded with a smile, then asked casually, "Are you planning to go alone? Should we assign a few men to accompany you?" "There's no need. The main entrance of the port office is clearly visible from here, just adjacent to the pier." Lawrence waved dismissively and pointed towards an illuminated area not too far from the shoreline. "Once the port inspectors leave, I want you all to examine all the ship's storage areas thoroughly, especially the lower deck where the relics and the sealed chambers are located, in case someone carelessly triggers a setup." "Aye, Captain." Once his first mate had departed, Lawrence drew in a deep breath of the night air. The piercing cold wind blowing in from the northern seas filled his lungs, snapping him back to full alertness. The seasoned captain then shook his head, grumbling slightly about the harsh weather conditions before making his way towards the nearby staircase. At the entrance of the staircase, a figure stood, arms folded across their chest, silently observing Lawrence in the fading light. Lawrence paused and stopped, only uttering hesitantly upon recognizing the figure, "Martha. What are you doing here? If I were in your place, I wouldn't waste time asking questions, and I'd get going immediately," the female navigator retorted, her arms still crossed as she regarded the old captain with an air of resignation. "You've let your guard down, Lawrence." "Martha, Lawrence instinctively stepped forward, sensing something amiss yet struggling to find the right words. He extended his hand slowly. "I've been missing you. How have you been holding up recently?" Martha remained silent, not responding to his question. The female navigator merely watched him quietly, her gaze seemingly focused on some distant point. Amidst the gentle sea breeze and the soothing rhythm of the waves, she began to hum softly. Set sail, the wanderer at sea presses on." Amidst the storm, amidst the cacophony, we're but a single plank away from the grasp of death. Stow away the jib, hoist the mainsail, release the ropes, grip the gunwale, we've arrived at the ocean's heart. Martha's voice gradually softened, eventually trailing off, her gaze locking onto Lawrence. She murmured, almost as if she were conversing with herself, "Lawrence, tread carefully, you've arrived at the ocean's heart." Suddenly, Lawrence drew in a deep breath, the crisp, cold air sharpening his senses. A memory flashed through his mind, prompting him to hurriedly rummage through his pocket in a frenzied manner. Martha advanced one step, slowly ambling towards him. Lawrence, how did you age so? The female navigator extended her hand, her voice raspy yet tender. Her youthful visage remained, and although the harshness of a life spent at sea had etched lines onto her face, she was as stunning as Lawrence remembered. It's been a lifetime, hasn't it? You're not the sprightly lad you once were, nor am I. Martha, Lawrence's throat bobbed as he groped for the small bottle in his pocket, missing it several times. He could almost detect the fragrance of Martha, that familiar, comforting scent with a hint of citrus, her chosen perfume. Martha, he finally located the small bottle. Clutching it in his hand, rooted to the spot on the deck, he observed the figure from his past extend her hand towards him, a scene he had replayed countless times in his dreams. As her hand, warm as he remembered, gently grazed the ends of his hair, he watched the woman from his past flash him a smile as if sharing a yearning that had remained unfulfilled for far too long. Martha, I'm sorry. Lawrence tightly gripped the medicine bottle and poured the sharp-tasting liquid into his mouth, causing Martha's image to become hazy and gradually vanish. In a strange, almost ghost-like way, Martha seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of her existence as if she had been a mere figment of the imagination from the outset. Yet, a vestige of her presence was still palpable. The faint residual warmth of her touch lingered on Lawrence's skin, specifically on the temples where her fingers had grazed. A subtle, lemony fragrance floated in the air, hinting at her lingering essence. Lawrence was overwhelmed by a mix of confusion and raw emotion. His hand, which was usually steady, trembled slightly as he attempted to replace the cap on a small glass bottle. His heart pounded within his chest, the beats thunderous and intense, outmatching the roars of the most tempestuous storms he had experienced in his lifetime. With a jolt, Lawrence's rational mind kicked in, like awakening from a prolonged and disorienting dream. He was struck by the realization of how precariously close he had been to losing himself completely, spiraling into a state of relentless delusion. For someone like him, a seasoned sea captain who had spent a significant part of his existence navigating the vast, unforgiving oceans, such an insidious mental state could spell disaster. Once trapped, it would be an immense struggle to claw back to the realm of sanity. However, in this moment of revelation, he didn't feel a surge of relief nor a lingering shiver of fear from his near miss with uncontrolled madness. All that consumed him was a heavy sense of melancholy and regret. This sentiment of sorrow and regret served as a harrowing reminder, a signal that deep within, he had stopped fighting against the concept of insanity itself. Striving to regain control, Lawrence drew a deep breath, attempting to clear the cobweb of jumbled thoughts that clouded his rational thinking. He cast a glance around him. The sturdy white oak ship lay beneath him, filled with crew members who relied on his expertise to steer them safely back to planned. Now was not the time to allow madness to take over. With a sigh that carried a hint of resignation, the veteran captain muttered to himself, "It's high time I retire." He commenced his journey towards the nearby staircase, but after just a few steps, his movement halted abruptly, a serious expression shadowing his face. His mind involuntarily rewound to the scene when Martha had materialized. Even though he was well aware that indulging in such a memory could be perilous and might trigger another hallucination of her, he found himself lost in the reminiscence. A pair of sentences Martha had allegedly spoken stirred an uncanny interest within him. "Lawrence, be careful, you've reached the ocean's heart. If I were you, I wouldn't waste time with questions and leave immediately, you've become less cautious." He found himself repeating these sentences subconsciously. Despite being aware that this illusory interaction was a result of his scrambled memory and disturbed cognitive function, he couldn't resist considering these words as a forewarning. Even if Martha didn't exist, was there a chance his subconscious had picked up on some impending danger? Could these sentences be an alarm bell ringing from deep within his intuitive psyche? Casting a wary glance around, the seasoned captain meticulously examined the white oak once again. Everything appeared as normal as it could be. Following this, he raised his eyes towards the adjacent island state. The neighboring frost presented a picture of normalcy as well. The adjacent port area was a tranquil scene, serene and unperturbed, while the city district not far away was gradually coming alive with the soft glow of twinkling lights. In the far-off distance, an imposing cliff towered over the seascape. Its stern and formidable silhouette was etched starkly against the dimming sky. Nevertheless, a subtle sensation of discomfort started to pervade Lawrence's being, rising like an unrelenting tide within his chest. Amid this growing unease, he found himself tuning into the soft lullaby of the nearby waves. Initially, he had difficulty differentiating it from the ambient sound of the ocean caressing the hull of the white oak, but it didn't take long for him to understand that the sound was echoing within his own mind. The soft melody of the waves, is it an omen of something threatening? Can it be the divine protection of the storm goddess Gomona manifesting itself? A sense of urgency dawned on Lawrence, and he promptly abandoned his initial plan of stepping ashore. Pivoting on his heel, he made a beeline towards the ship's bridge. The chilly night wind blew past his ears, its shrill howl slicing through the silence of the night and rousing his senses. Captain. His first mate, who was manning the bridge, appeared taken aback by Lawrence's sudden arrival. Rising from his chair, he hurriedly moved towards his captain. I thought you were going ashore. Circumstances have changed, Lawrence replied tersely. Something feels off. How long have we been docked here? Has anyone sneaked off the ship? No, the first mate responded without hesitation. You had instructed everyone to remain aboard, and they all complied. We have been anchored here for a few hours now. That's fortunate nobody disembarked. Lawrence nodded briskly, then turned his attention towards the control panel. Fire up the steam core, we're vacating this port. What? The first mate was visibly taken aback, leaving the port. But we've just. Interrupting him mid-sentence, Lawrence explained, something's not right with this place. I can't quite identify what it is, but it's unsettling. Remember the earlier complications with the observatory? And prior to that, when we were unable to communicate with Frost. Ever since then, our collective guard seems to have dropped. It's as if something is manipulating us. Lawrence conveyed his concerns rapidly, fully conscious of how eccentric his order might appear. He had no tangible evidence to back up his feelings of discomfort except for his gut intuition. After completing a lengthy voyage, both the crew and the ship's machinery were in desperate need of some respite. Therefore, his decision to abruptly depart the port seemed audacious, even rash. Moreover, the act of leaving the port required compliance with various maritime regulations and coordination with the harbor authorities. Igniting the steam core without prior notification would be a flagrant breach of protocols, and he would be held accountable for his actions. Yet, the ominous foreboding within Lawrence's heart was intensifying, and the sound of the waves echoing within his mind grew increasingly loud and persistent. It was as if Gomona's divine protection was urging him to sever all connections with the port authorities, to refrain from uttering another word. His first mate stared at the captain, an array of emotions flickering across his face. Then, snapping to attention, he saluted and responded with a decisive, "Aye, Captain." Aboard the ship, the captain's command was absolute. An unhinged captain could steer the entire crew towards disaster, but on the flip side, a seasoned and knowledgeable captain could navigate them out of perilous situations. The command was promptly relayed across the ship. The bewildered sailors were hastily rallied, and they quickly sprang into action, making preparations for an unforeseen departure with their well-honed skills. A new metal catalyst was loaded into the steam core, triggering the deep, reassuring hum of machinery within the bowels of the White Oak. The sailors discreetly loosened the moored ropes and hauled the gangway back onto the deck. Meanwhile, Lawrence stationed himself on the bridge, watching the activity on the dock through the expansive glass window with hawk-like intensity. There were figures moving about on the dock, their forms hazy and almost spectral under the soft glow of the gas lamps. A couple of freight vehicles rumbled by in the distance, their bulky silhouettes casting long, eerie shadows on the cobblestone path. No one seemed to have noticed the ship firing up its steam core in the cloak of darkness, nor did any obstruction emerge to prevent the White Oak from making its stealthy escape. The circumstances were unfolding much better than Lawrence had anticipated. His pessimistic contingency plan had even considered the possibility that the moment the steam core was rekindled, numerous monstrous tentacles might rise from the surrounding sea, dragging the White Oak into its watery depths. Ensure complete darkness on board, and do not blow the steam whistle, Lawrence swiftly instructed his first mate. He then proceeded to the helm, gripping the wheel with a firm hand. I'll handle the steering, keep the boiler pressure high, and be prepared for an overload at any moment. Yes, Captain. Though plagued with doubts, everyone aboard the ship adhered to their old captain's orders without question. Lawrence could feel the metal leviathan beneath him awakening and stirring into action. As the ship maintained its blackout, the underwater propellers began their rhythmic churn, nudging the White Oak away from the port. However, the sound of water churning under the ship's movement filled the air, causing a palpable tension to grip everyone. Their eyes remained fixed on the silhouette of the city-state, now enveloped in near darkness. Taking this all in, Lawrence felt the clammy sweat moistening his palms. Yet, the city-state exhibited no signs of abnormality. Even though the stealthy actions of the White Oak were likely not as concealed as Lawrence had hoped, no signs of curiosity or investigation followed. His gaze shifted to the radio communication station nearby. The telegraph machine was ominously silent. In an ordinary circumstance, the port authority should have already initiated an urgent communication, and the port officials on duty would be questioning the White Oak's abrupt departure. Yet, strangely, there was only silence. This peculiar lack of reaction only fortified Lawrence's resolve, affirming his suspicion that his judgment had been accurate. Something was undeniably off about this place. The steam core's power surged another notch, the propellers spun with increasing vigor, and the White Oak swiftly retreated from the dock. Directly ahead of the ship, the open sea unfolded like an enormous canvas, the water's surface sparkling under the feeble light. Inhaling a deep breath, Lawrence tightened his grip on the wheel, full speed ahead. A gust of ashen wind coursed through the courtyard, culminating in the cathedral's entrance to form the figure of Agatha, who moved briskly through the antechamber and nave, heading towards the Chapel of Contemplation, where Bishop Ivan resided. The statue of Bartok, the god of death, held a silent vigil at the far end of the chapel. A dark, lit open coffin was positioned horizontally on the platform at the statue's base. Bishop Ivan, who typically rested within the coffin, was standing next to it, his gaze lifting in Agatha's direction. The bishop was swathed in bandages like a mummy, revealing only a single eye. He was dressed in a black robe adorned with gold trimmings for this occasion, a scepter in his grasp. As Agatha approached, he broke the silence. "I've been informed about Dagger Island. I gathered as much since you're personally overseeing this meeting," Agatha responded with a nod. Her tone held a note of concern. "But can your physical state endure this?" Bishop Ivan raised his bandaged hand, and from the gaps in the wraps, it seemed a ghostly, gray-white mist was slowly wafting out. "As long as either the body or the will possesses the strength, it's sufficient." Agatha had been aware for quite some time that Bishop Ivan's life was gradually drawing to a close. Underneath the layers of firmly bound bandages that covered him, his body was practically skeletal, with very little flesh remaining. What allowed him to remain standing wasn't solely the divine miracle Bartok granted but also his spirit's sheer determination and steadfastness. The peculiar state of the bishop's body was a mystery to most. Even Agatha, known as the gatekeeper of frost, was privy only to the vague explanation that an accident from many years ago was responsible for his physical condition. However, the true nature of this accident was a topic Bishop Ivan carefully avoided, never openly discussing it even when she was around. It was a secret Agatha chose not to probe into, of her own accord. Bishop Ivan's demeanor clearly reflected a deep sense of melancholy. He stood silent for a long while before suddenly voicing his fears. "We are on the brink of a crisis." "Yes, Bishop Ivan," Agatha responded, nodding her understanding. "I will strive with all my might to expose the reality and subvert the devious plot being hatched by those with destruction in their hearts." "No, you don't quite grasp the situation," Bishop Ivan retorted, shaking his head. "The truth of this looming crisis may be far more complex and bewildering than we can imagine, Agatha. The insidious activities of the cult members might indeed contribute to the crisis, but they certainly don't encompass the entirety of it. I have a premonition." At this, Agatha's brow furrowed slightly. A premonition. An uncanny familiarity, reminiscent of the time 50 years ago, just before the upheaval occurred. The entire city was permeated with a mood quite similar to the one now Ivan shared, his voice slow and thoughtful, a city-state that on the surface appeared utterly normal, yet was teeming with bewildering, inexplicable anomalies, almost as if we were all suddenly trapped in an uncanny, indistinguishable dream. We would occasionally catch a glimpse of horrifying scenes at the dream's fringe, but our feeble human comprehension refused to fully understand them. blinding us to the truth that was tantalizingly close. Are you experiencing that sensation? As if, the distortion is plainly in front of us, yet we stubbornly keep our eyes shut. I'm not sure I follow. Agatha expressed her uncertainty. Are you suggesting some kind of cognitive disruption? That this disruption is clouding our judgment? Instead of responding to her query, Bishop Ivan, after several seconds of contemplative silence, segued into a topic that seemed completely unrelated. Agatha, have I ever spoken to you about the last Queen's Guard, from half a century ago? Or about the second waterway, buried deep within the heart of the city-state? The second waterway. Agatha appeared taken aback, as a flurry of knowledge resurfaced in her mind. I have some understanding of that. It was a part of a colossal subterranean infrastructure developed by the Frost Queen for the city-state. However, with the termination of the Queen's reign, the unfinished structure was deserted. Due to severe structural deterioration and financial constraints, it has remained forsaken up to this day. Most people aren't even aware of its existence. Yes, it remains forsaken, and only keepers of the gate like you and old relics such as myself are privy to its existence, Bishop Ivan stated, a slight shake of his head accentuating his words. And what about the last Queen's Guard? Agatha queried, curiosity piqued. What prompted you to suddenly mention them? The last Queen's Guard was a unit that exhibited fierce resilience, continuing their resistance even after the Queen's palace fell to the rebels. They utilized the city-state's subterranean structures to stage their last stand. Bishop Ivan's voice was low, imbued with an unmistakable air of nostalgia. Their final fortress was the entrance to the second waterway. After being overpowered, they demolished all the connecting wells and were consequently interred beneath the earth. The reason I broach this topic today is because an old rumor from those times unexpectedly crossed my mind. Agatha's gaze sharpened at the mention of a rumor. The tale goes that, as the vertical wells were being destroyed, the invaders besieging the underground base suddenly heard an array of eerie sounds emanating from the depths. Even amidst the utter ruin of their subterranean stronghold, the last Queen's Guard began to shout as if they were initiating an assault on an enemy. Bishop Ivan slowly dredged up the distant memory. For quite some time after that, there were reports of people hearing the resonating sounds of warfare and war cries echoing from deep within the earth. In due course, whispers began to circulate that the last Queen's Guard had transformed into a grotesque legion lurking beneath the ground. They were said to be engaged in ceaseless battles, fueled by a simmering rage, awaiting the opportune moment of vulnerability in the new regime established by the traitors. At that moment, they were believed to emerge from their subterranean realm to exact their vengeance. Agatha's countenance grew grave. The most vulnerable moment of the new regime. You mentioned earlier that we're confronting a crisis beyond our comprehension, and the prevailing mood in the city mirrors that of 50 years ago. Is this the moment of vulnerability? Will the mythical Queen's Guard surface from the depths? Do you lend credence to this legend? I don't believe this legend. The Queen's Guard was unequivocally decimated. I was a witness to their downfall. Even if, Bishop Ivan started but abruptly halted as if a new thought had dawned upon him. He then shook his head. Even if a handful of survivors had managed to hold out temporarily in the second waterway, it's improbable that they survived until the present day. The meager descendants who are still alive lack the power to challenge the city-state's rule, even if we are currently grappling with a crisis. Agatha fell silent for a brief while, and after about 10 seconds, she abruptly broke the silence. The legend of the last Queen's Guard might be steeped in falsehood, but it's undeniable that a vast, unregulated area persists underneath frost. Your concern isn't about the Queen's Guard who vanished half a century ago, but rather something else lurking within the second waterway, isn't it? We've been diligently scouring the entire city for a significant period of time, managing to apprehend a number of followers of the annihilation cult. However, they are all relatively minor figures, most lacking any adept skills in remaining hidden. It's improbable that these individuals could be responsible for creating the plethora of counterfeits and elemental pollution that plague the city-state, let alone instigate the disturbances on Dagger Island, Bishop Ivan affirmed, nodding gravely. Upon reflection, the minions we've apprehended seem more akin to scattered soldiers who have slipped from a more substantial nest. The majority of the city-state has been searched thoroughly, perhaps even multiple times, leaving only one area largely unexplored. I fear it might be the depths below. After giving the bishop's words some thought, Agatha responded with a hint of uncertainty, yet, according to the historical records, a significant portion of the second waterway has severely collapsed, rendering most of its passageways into treacherous traps. Add to this the presence of toxic pollution in vast stretches of darkness, survival down there seems untenable. The followers of the annihilation cult, despite their unsavory beliefs, are still living beings. Aside from a small number of priests who have almost morphed into insidious demons, most still require a human-friendly environment to survive. How could they possibly be hiding in such an inhospitable place? Despite the grim prospects, we should at least attempt a search, Bishop Ivan replied slowly. We can commence by probing the collapsed sections around the metal mines. After reflecting for a few moments, Agatha offered a gentle nod of agreement. To accomplish this, we'll need the assistance of City Hall, protective gear, underground machinery, and professional engineers. Such resources are beyond the cathedral's capacity. I'll undertake the task of negotiations, Bishop Ivan reassured her with a nod. Draft a list detailing the personnel and equipment you'll require, and I'll find a way to procure them for you. Understood. I'll have the list prepared for you by noon. Agatha didn't hesitate, and before the workforce and supplies arrive, I wish to conduct a thorough interrogation of the captured cultists to determine if they could provide any valuable information. As the grip of the night loosened, the sky gradually brightened. Vision 001 began its ascent from the city-state's edge, and the majestic sun slowly climbed into the sky. The double rune circle passed over the towering spires and rooftops, bringing with it warmth that dissipated the overnight chill. At the entrance of Cemetery Number 3, the hefty, intricately carved iron gate creaked open. As the gate moved, it swept the accumulated snow on the ground, leaving behind twin arc-like trails as if wings had been spread. The old caretaker, adorned in a worn-out coat, stood in front of the ajar cemetery gate, took a deep breath, and gazed upon the clear sky. The sky was pristine, yet for some inexplicable reason, the vibrancy of the morning was unable to alleviate the irksomeness brewing within him. The elderly caretaker's gaze drifted towards the bustling city streets as distant sounds of horses and carriages faded into the background, much like the uneasy winds from the previous night. Subsequently, even the cloudless sky seemed tainted with a veneer of artifice. Murmuring a string of grumbles under his breath, his gaze shifted to the incline leading up to the cemetery. The lines etched deep into the old man's face eased momentarily, only to intensify a second later as his brows furrowed in puzzlement. He had noticed a small figure materializing on the incline, trudging towards him with a mix of struggle and tenacity. Sensing the old man's scrutiny, the tiny figure halted deliberately and offered a cheerful wave. The old caretaker's frown deepened. He patiently waited for the individual to come closer, not saying a word until Annie had brushed the snowflakes off her trousers and boots. His voice tinged with annoyance as he finally said, "You're back again. Yesterday was peaceful without you. I had assumed you'd finally decided to stay home. Why have you returned today?" "I wished to visit yesterday too," Annie replied, sticking her tongue out in tease. "However, my mother thought the roads were heavily laden with snow, and we needed to wait for the snowplows to clear the main roads before venturing out." Before the old man could respond, she had already presented him with a small package. "I've brought cookies." "It seems I've been consuming cookies daily." The old man cast a glance at the package in her hands, his eyelids twitching, yet he accepted the offering. "Please extend my gratitude to Mrs. Baloney." Annie's face lit up with joy. "Is there something else?" The old caretaker's gaze swept over the girl standing before him. "The cemetery is not accepting visitors today." "Oh, no. I simply wished to chat with you," Annie replied with her usual cheerfulness. "Did you know? We've recently had a few new guests move into our house. Can you guess who they are?" The 12-year-old girl was notoriously bad at keeping secrets. "I have no interest," the old caretaker grumbled, displaying his disinterest with an impatient wave of his hand. "It's your home, you can lease it out to whomever you wish. Why would that concern me?" Ignoring his reaction, Annie continued with an even brighter smile and an air of inexplicable pride. "It's the tall man wrapped in bandages. Remember the one we saw at the cemetery gate the last time? Are you all right, Grandpa Caretaker?"